All right. Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening if you are somewhere in Europe. Thank you very much for having me. It is truly an honor to join such distinguished colleagues in speaking about war games. Indeed, I have been working for NATO for the last 5 years, designing war games, executing them. So I amassed quite a bit of knowledge that I shared in my book. At the moment, I have transitioned. I work for the Hague University of Applied Sciences, and I am also specializing in war games there. So if any of my students joined us, then especially warm greetings. I would like to say very much thank you to Sebastian Bay as well as Diderik. I saw you in the audience for recommending this meeting. And get to it. Today I will be speaking about this book. I think it was also in the thumbnail. It is a book about wargaming experiences that span from soldiers, scientists, and civilians. And we have agreed with the organizers to limit the scope to 3 wargames that I will present to you. And between each segment, there will be time to ask questions, but I am also looking at the chat. So if there is something burning to ask, then I will also try to respond. I already see that there is a question. The book at the moment, it's possible to purchase it via Amazon or via the publisher's website. That is simply wargamingexperiences.com. The digital version, I expect it to be available in September, so it will arrive with longer timeline. All right, and today I have decided to go without PowerPoint. I always try it. Sometimes I win, sometimes I lose, but I do very much appreciate more conversation than a monologue. So that is the reason that I will try to just speak with you about the 3 war games, and let's see how that goes. The whole format of the book is about different war games, but also how I developed as a designer throughout timelines. And you will see, let's say, samples of 3 of them. So there will be also additional things that you can find out later if you are reading through the chapters. As you saw in the description of the talk, the first one that I would like to speak about is the Baltic Challenge. And obviously, because we will be speaking about NATO, all of these war games are connected with the interest of the organization. And at the time that I started designing war games within the project, this was the biggest deployment that NATO has since years. And that was quite an obvious choice to try to go to the most relevant scenario that we could. So that was how it all started. So in a way, that was the first war game, and I would say for many people that are going into wargaming, this will be the most difficult one because you are creating a precedent. Before you are showing the wargame, this is quite an exotic theory or sometimes an alternative method of analysis, but rarely is it obvious that, of course, wargames are useful. So this was very important in the overall development because this gave a structure and a reference that we could always come back to. Before I say how it came to exist, how I designed it, I can also say that I have always used 7 elements of design, and this is just to structure in a way how you went from an idea to an ended war game. And this for me was the purpose. That is always how I aligned everything on the way. So if we knew what this game is serving, it is much easier to choose what should be the material or what are the mechanics. And then this was the beginning and the end. So I always evaluate it as well. Did we reach the purpose or not? I also always describe the problem that the war game is approaching or responding to. So what is in reality what you are trying to assist in solving. Then I also included approach, and that is simply how from your perspective you did it. So in a way it is a transparent process and other people could pick up on it as well. And then you have a method and the mechanics which are strictly related, and they explain how the game works, and in the end results. I also always come back to the meaning of the results. So I have a whole section about things that you can measure and things that matter. So sometimes it is not precisely a numerical value, but it would be, for example, a finding that a given strategy is stronger than the others and why. So that is how I approached war games, and the free war games that we will speak about today, I will also tell you in this sequence. Unless, as I said, we will have some questions or comments between, and then we can go back and forth, like in a proper conversation. All right, the Baltic Challenge that started in 2017. A year earlier, we had the Warsaw Summit that outlined a number of steps that were supposed to boost deterrence. And most probably you also recognize that the reason was Eastern flank became quite turbulent, quite unexpectedly from the perspective of the alliance. And there was a lot of later called hybrid or unconventional tactics that were not seen before or were not applied on such scale. So we started to look at war games that could replicate this challenge, but in a realistic setting. So the purpose was to train NATO personnel better to deployments to the eastern flank, and to also switch the mindset from deterrence in terms of keeping up the borders like it was previously in the Cold War, because a lot of officers still had that point of reference, that mental model, where Eastern Europe or partially Central Europe was not sovereign. So that was a standoff between back then Soviet Union and NATO, and they do not perceive how the situation currently is completely different. And we have heard from the commanders of NATO units in Poland and in Baltic states that there is an issue that this old mental model is translated to current circumstances, and obviously that produces friction. And the main friction is you have to take into account the population that lives within your own territory. And that's how we came to changing the wall model. So model of two forces standing outside of two sides of the wall towards a model of domino, where if one of the countries would be attacked or would fall prey to some of the tactics, then all of the security of other countries and eventually the alliance would suffer. So that was, in maybe not so short words, the purpose. We wanted a war game that is playing out deterrence. So it is not at the point where you have tanks at the border, but it is at the point of 2017. You can also translate it to 2020. And basically we notice that there are activities, but they are below the threshold of war, or they are rarely kinetic. So what does NATO personnel do in that circumstances? And that led to an approach of modeling reality and also trying to look at initiative or courses of action that could be proposed in this new situation. And at the time of this development, there was a course for civil military cooperation field and staff workers, and I received a spot. So that was very, very long, lasting question: where could we play the first war game? And that finally happened. So there was a course that lasted for 5 days plus 5 days practice, but the students had basically 4 days of theory. And then at the last day, we thought, okay, let's do something interactive and let's try out the dynamics as they are. So I knew that the approach will be to create something simple but meaningful, and that will support this purpose, that people can look through other perspectives, through other way. And that led to the method of basically advanced role-playing wargame. We had 16 roles mapped out from NGOs, local population, NATO units, but as well, we had the red team that doesn't have to be named, but it is just adversary. And with this knowledge that we are playing the Baltic Challenge and we are trying to find out how deterrence is successful or not, you would receive the assignment, you would receive the mission for each player and the map. And the map is crucial because you need to share the same space to propose the actions. Otherwise, they would turn very abstract, and you wanted to have a very particular way of looking on effectiveness. And we had two main tasks in this war game that started with so-called hearts and minds. So within the players catalog, we had always 3 representatives of the local population, and I also made sure that they are different. So they are not a monolithic group of the locals, but they were separated into 3 players that all had different motivations, different missions, different backgrounds, ethnicity, language. So you would have to account for that when you are preparing your plan. And then we had 3 main teams that tried to convince the local population to support them. And there you could look how does the population interact with different players and whether you are understanding how you could convince them to cross to your side and to support your activities. So we played it out much so in a way of introducing and of bargaining with the environment. And after everybody was familiar and the population chose which team they are joining, then we came to the main point of the war game. And yes, indeed, I see a comment that you could go into very unethical tactics. They also occurred with a higher or lower level of success. So that is still debatable. With that, you had 3 teams that would compete in the next challenge. And I called it the fog of social war. Because we are under the threshold of kinetic actions, much of the activities were either undercover or they were very much camouflaged under some social actions. That's why you could recognize that name. I based this particular part on a bow tie model. It was loosely inspired because we did not go through the risk assessment route, but we kept the shape. So if you imagine a bow tie, you have basically 2 sides and the knot in the middle, and you would get to propose, let's say, 10 actions. And there are two requirements to these actions. First of all, they have to be linked to a point on the map. So we are all playing in the same city and we are trying to win the deterrence there. And that is very important for later scoring. Second part, it has to be as well realistic. So you cannot say, I build a castle and I am the king of the city. You have to prepare something that would make sense and that could contribute to your mission of the team. So it wouldn't be completely destructive. That way, we would collect from three teams. One of them was the red team that tried to gain influence in the city. White team was the humanitarians, neutrals, NGOs that were trying to de-escalate. And then we had blue team, and as always, that was NATO, and they were trying to do what I outlined in the first part. So they were trying to do deterrence and presence. And then when we have that actions, we also have the bow tie as a shape. I would place first the defensive actions of NATO, then the neutral actions, the white actions in the middle, and at last we would look at the red actions. And first of all, we looked whether some of them duplicated or matched each other. So if one of the teams would be trying to poison the source of the water, but the other team took as an action, I am protecting the water sources, then they basically excluded each other. And then we spoke about actions that were not countered, and we gave them points if they were realistic and contributed to the mission. So that was the main task that all the teams conducted, and they conducted it according to the three perspectives, three missions. And after we saw who is the winner, because there was a point for each successful action, then we would do a debriefing. And within the debriefing, we went into reality. So would that action have effect, and why so? And if there was a precedent or incident in the past, then I would bring it forward that this indeed happened, and this is how we have to understand it or prepare not to face it again. Or if there at times happened things that did not have a good response, we would go into why that has to be done better. And with that, we had the first war game that was simple but meaningful. It prepared you to look at the eastern flank because you knew what is happening there, what kind of dynamics are involved, and based on previous experiences or the lessons learned by current NATO units and commanders, you would look at, all right, this is how I have to prepare to do that job. And what I can say in retrospective, because that game exists now for 3 years and it is not now, let's say, stopped because of Corona circumstances, but it has been running for at least 15, 20 iterations. First of all, there is a balance. So none of the teams has an advantage. And I can recognize it because the victory rotates. And if you look at the model, you have one neutral team that is de-escalating, one team that is defending, and one team that is attacking or establishing influence. You would maybe think that they are at a disadvantage because there are two teams against them, but actually that did not occur in reality. So despite an open format, the neutral and the blue team were not cooperating, and that was very well leveraged by the red team. And that means that if we come back to the question that I posed at the beginning, how do you win deterrence? What is the victory on the eastern flank? You really have to look at what is your strength and what is your weakness. And at least in the war game, we could observe very high relation to the leadership. So you would need an individual in the group that is able to lead the team into a focused effort. And that sometimes can be very tricky. And what it led to was my thought that on one side you have divide and conquer, which is one of the oldest strategies that you can revoke in your memory. But on the other side, you also have ally and counter. So how can you group your efforts in a way that obviously benefits both of your missions? And how can you not duplicate your efforts and assign the right resources where they are needed? And that was the first thought that I assigned as well as a result. And second one was an experience that we noticed it is much easier to rally against. So it is much easier if you tell me, well, this is your enemy and you have to prepare to repel that phenomenon, than to rally for. Then if you tell me, I need to work for peace now. What does it mean? What do you want me to do? And with that mechanic of proposing courses of action, we noticed that people translated the concept of deterrence into a practical task. So they slowly started to begin to realize what are they not only working against, but also working for. And that brought a good first practice that later turned into a big argument why we are using war games and how we can grow them into different scenarios. I see a couple of questions, so I think we could pick them up before we move on to the next case. I am looking at the chat and I will just read out the questions because I think they do not save for the recording. I have a question from Enrico. When you are modeling the war game, do you base it on certain doctrines or official guidance, on possible NATO response for such certain situations, or do you make the assumptions from the ground up? Depends what is the purpose of the war game. In this case, we were wargaming deterrence. That means we did not go to the point of triggering a campaign. And that means that we had the guidelines and we had the decisions of summit in Warsaw, and we had on the other side the reality, the feedback from the headquarters and from the units. So we knew where we had the most weaknesses that need to be trained more. And that is how we established how we will present the war game, what will be the model, where are the uncertainties. So it was very much reality-based, need-based, and we went from there. I see as well that indeed more people than me notice the confirmation bias and how we as well need to translate the scenario of Ukraine and how use of force changed there and how we need to learn from that indeed. All right, what are the metrics, assessments, measurements of both tasks that I mentioned and how this affects look in the game? So first of all, hearts and minds. That was quite simplistic. We had the representatives of the local population and they would meet with each team so they can recognize them and make a decision. And after that, they would be asked, which team do you want to choose? And if they chose, let's say, team blue or team red, they were given extra actions in the next task. So the fact that the population is supporting you gave you a bonus in terms of proposing more actions in the next round. That was the reward, and physically speaking, your team was bigger, so most of the time it also gave you more brains, roughly speaking. And in terms of the second task, so the bow tie frame, as I mentioned, after checking whether the actions were countered, that means 0 points if somebody figured out your plan, basically, and your actions passed the threshold of being realistic, connected to the map, and supporting your mission, you received 1 point for each successful action. So I would conclude that usually the result would be within the frame of 3 to 6 for each team, and that would create one winner. There was one instance where we had a triple tie, so all the teams scored the same, but it was very much an exception. I see as well, if opposing actions countered each other, were there teams that dedicated multiple actions in the same round to ensuring that critical actions were enacted? No. I would say that we have also added points to the map. So let's say the point was the barracks, and one of the teams would be attacking, the other defending, the third one would be doing a demonstration there. All of them address this point, and if we saw that they are excluding each other, then they would automatically be countered. And I have to say that not many teams decided to commit more than one action to the same point. They rather tried to distribute them so they would have higher chances of surprising the other teams. We have a bigger question about players, and that is about player selection and leaders that focus a team. I will come back to it because the last case that I will be describing today was very much about collective performance and individual competency. So I will pick it up in the last case. All right, a question about NATO in terms of the DIME activities, the diplomatic, information, military, economic activities. I have introduced in actually all of the games players that were non-NATO. That means we had a blue team that was representing NATO, but we also had white teams for humanitarians, international organizations. We had as well the green team and of course red team. So within red team, you can notice there is less rules, and that is very much preferred by some people, but for the others, they would have some limitations indeed on what they can do to support their mission, and that is how we would simulate DIME activities. So it was not only NATO within the war game, but there were the dynamics of other players. And if that was not enough, if I wanted to include more events, then I would put them in the scenario as well. Do we apply red teaming or any other decision-making tool for assumption check after creating your scenarios? Bigger question, so I will respond in between, but it will also come back, I believe, in other cases. Yes, so they are always cross-checked on multiple levels. First of all, is it realistic? And that depends, of course, on what the scenario is portraying, but If we are speaking about scenario that is showing dynamics of current events, then I would simply reach out to people on the ground or people that experienced that events. So I would check with the actual humans that experience such events. And I would also look at the science behind it. If we have any data that is supporting particular assumptions, conclusions, then I would also inject that. And lastly, I would run multiple tests with different audiences, because you will also get feedback based off the background of the person, and we wanted to make it in different dimensions right. So the last reality check that I do is it true? Are we producing something that is meaningful, or are we just producing something that is easy to measure? And I wanted it to be translating to truth. So I can also mention that I've seen a lot of examples where something can go wrong, including also my designs, but I mentioned it in other talk as well, that there was a war game that was supposed to prepare United Nations personnel to deploy to Africa. And for some reason, they have designed the system in a way that it showed you that the biggest threat to you is malaria. So it showed you the mosquitoes, the different countermeasures you can take, but it has not, for example, included the mission in Mali that is the deadliest to the personnel since years. So it has not spoken about these sorts of threats or attacks that I would say is a priority to prepare the personnel that is going to that regions to know about it. So I always look whether what is in the scenario is true, or is it indeed a projection of somebody's ideas. So I try to keep it straight, and that means you should accept very early critics, and very often you should also erase some ideas if they are not according to reality, but also on the other side, you should be ready to defend when your idea is true and it is improving the practice. So that was one of my big experiences, that you also have to try to frame it in the right way, which might be very difficult. But if that is all questions that were related to the Baltics, then I will slowly move on, because I see one more question. And that is the question from Diderik's talk. What is the level of wargaming proficiency of the standard participant? And what level of player do I design for? Before we started implementing wargames, I ran a small survey, a study on the kind of player we would get. And I've looked at a couple of parameters. So do they play games at all? When was the last time you played a game? What is the complexity level that would be acceptable? And indeed, whether they are at all familiar with war games and the systems or not. And then you can notice that there is a distribution. I would say that the lowest number in the general population was the traditional wargamers, so the big chunky games that you can actually set up for hours and play for weeks with hex and counters and this sorts of mechanics. So I had to accept that that is below 5% this player. Then I had a bit bigger percentage of people that at all played board games, but they were usually, let's say, on the beginners level or the family spiel. So They were rather social than experts, big systems, Euro games type of games. And then we had very, very small part of wargamers in terms of professional wargaming or PME. The biggest part of the population was aware of the role-playing games, and that's why you will see this mechanic coming back, that it is very instinctive for people to receive a role and try to play it out. So this very largely gets you out of the trouble of not understanding a certain system. And in the question of how can you prepare your students, your participants to play a war game, explanation is everything. And I have to say that I've seen very talented people that can present to you even a complex system and you will be happy to play it, whereas there are also opposites where you are just disengaged very early. So this has to be really tested and really up to the standard that if you are presenting to 25 people, all of them have to be able to follow you. And it has to be, in a way, a group effort. So it has to support each other. So it's an extreme case where we had a participant that did not speak English well. So it would be very difficult to follow the explanation and also the mechanics. We partnered that person up. So they were just playing as a duo, and that way it was not tension or pressure, but it was still following, of course, all of the tasks that were prescribed. And that is what I can say, that of course, if you have a bigger system, you have to look whether you can always execute it. And I had a number of war games which I split up. So if you are speaking about rounds, if you are speaking about modules, if you are speaking about maturity of the group, you can look and say, okay, this group is able to execute the first part of the war game, but they have troubles to move on. So it is better to explain to them in more detail the first part than to do the second part wrong. And this way you can adjust to the level of participants you have. And it is maybe heavy on the facilitator, but on the other side, if you are also the designer, then for you it is quite easy to imagine how you can scale up or down the level. I also have a question about cultural differences in enthusiasm for wargaming from different countries. So that is very interesting. I have to say that I will not make a rule or try to generalize different nations, because it would be highly unfair. I will say that what I can notice is that in the American system, somehow it is more natural. So if I mention a war game, they are not surprised. They can more quickly jump to playing. I also see that there is not a divide between old and new NATO members in that manner. I can mention, but I don't know the reasoning behind it or what is the precise explanation, that the new NATO members were actually more eager to play war games. And I think that might be linked with the fact that all of the scenarios were up to date. So they were more included in them than with the previous models that they experienced. All right, last question for this case study, because I will try to fit into the timeline. Is there a chance to play the same game before and after deployment? And is there perception change between the two? I had not experience the same person that played it before and after deployment, largely because the purpose was to prepare for deployment. So they would not, let's say, come back to the same event. But I did have comments that came back with reality check, and I also seeked them out. So I took that step to check whether what we have covered in the war game, what we have concluded, what we have shown, was it correct? And this way we were able to also calibrate over time what is now the priority to teach or to show. So in many ways, that was the feedback I have received, and I have looked at the measurement whether this as a method compares to lectures or to other ways of training, and it has ranked higher for from the students. So at least we know that this is more illustrative of the actual challenge than what has been done before. And for that data, of course, I was very interested in, because that was also something that could support further development. And that is where I will pick up the second case study. And let's say we will move in time a bit. So we will fast forward 2 years into the project. Between those two cases, of course, there was a lot of different war games, but I thought that this one is a interesting one to present to you as well. Baltic Challenge at that time became a staple war game. It was implemented in CCOE, so I was very satisfied with that outcome. But I noticed that we have been successful inside, but completely unknown outside of that small circle. And I decided to design a war game for other audiences. So the purpose of this game was reaching outside of the small audience that we so far had, and have the same impact. So give a demonstration of what this war game is achieving, and showing as well to other practitioners how they could benefit from using it in different contexts. So the problem that it responded to was a kind of a bubble, and I recognized it in the book as preaching to the choir. So it is an established mean, and everybody knows how it works, and it is a success, but it is always the same 100 people in the room. And after a while, you can greet each other by name, but you are not reaching anybody else, and you are very limited in your success. And it is a bigger problem of a lot of specialized functions that involve a small circle of professionals. And if it would be to reach its full potential, I believe it has to get outside of that inner circle. Because you have improvements, but they are not shared. They are kind of consumed within to the inside and not outside as well. So I think that many of the conclusions that were reached during the war games would also contribute to NATO, to other capabilities. So I decided to try to make something that would be at one side demonstrating wargaming, on the other side it would also be accessible and meaningful to others. So with that being said, I decided for the approach of quick decision exercise, which I think is also a very well-known method of wargaming. And the reason was it is easily adjustable to the audience. So you are starting with one baseline, but as a facilitator, it is relatively easy to turn it into a particular focus. So if you would be speaking to United Nations, you can focus on protection of civilians. But if you are presenting this war game to special forces, you could look into counterinsurgency tactics. So this way, you have a demonstration that you could play with in terms of results. So what you need for material side, you need the background, you need the position of the person in the quick decision exercise, so on which level their decision is, the role, the structure, the unit, if it is within a hierarchical order, and a task or a mission to be accomplished. And you need to present the topography and human terrain, if that is also part of the war game. And obviously, it has to be based on a scenario. And at that time, I was considering what would be universally important to many specialties, many functions, many units, and I came to the idea of presenting Battle for Mosul in Iraq, and that is due to urban combat and one of the worst set of dilemmas that was generated in the last years. So I decided to turn it into a scenario which you could play out, and as I mentioned, you could also focus on different elements of it. As in most of my games, I had more than one player, so this time it was 4. We had coalition forces, we had people in the city, we had humanitarians, and we had the red team, which also does not need to be named, but it was the current occupant of the city that was chased out in that battle. And if you would be organizing a similar exercise, then obviously you will also need a facilitator that is guiding that 4 players throughout the war game, as well as providing reality checks. And that was the main mechanics. So we had 4 stages, 4 rounds, 4 leading questions that all players were separately answering that led to discussion. After each question, I provided reality check. That meant I asked the question, the groups worked on their answer, and after that I said what really happened and what do we need to remember about it, and we moved on to the next round. There were 4 questions. The first one was before the offensive started, and that was about the bridges connecting the east and west side of the city. And the question was, I guess, fairly simple in its format, not in its answer, because the question was, what do you want to do about the bridges? And you can imagine the answers are very different for the red team, for coalition forces, for the people, and for the humanitarians. So we would go through the logic, the reasoning, or the feelings that guided the decision of the participants. That was the first question, and after each group made up their mind, then I told them what happened in reality, which was all the bridges but one were destroyed. And then we have the consequence, because next question was about the old city, which was at that time isolated due to that first episode, and the question would come back. So it would be, what do you want to do in the old city? And then you have obviously different dilemmas, different sub-questions, because you are looking at the historical city center, you are looking at hospitals, libraries, universities. So you have to look as well at the 250,000 people that were trapped at that time in the center of Mosul. So you would be facing very different problems. And then the same way. So I would ask the question, the groups would work out their decision, and I would come back with a reality check. And this time it makes sense to speak to each group separately. So you would say what happened with the people in the city, you would say what happened with the red team, what happened with coalition forces, what did the humanitarians do in that situation. And I had two more questions. One of them was about the outskirts, and that was what do you want to do with the outskirts, with the industrial areas? And if you have followed in any of the scenarios the urban environment, you would know that there are basically death traps, and the forces that go into these districts have to go building by building to basically stabilize it. So despite an overwhelming victory in other areas, this led to protracted fighting, and that was also what we have focused on in that part. And last question was actually about your strategy after the city is liberated. So there is a victory, the city is relatively safe, being destroyed but safe. And what does your team want to achieve at this point? And the reason is very often war games focus only on the kinetic part and overriding your enemy, but they do not address the day after, the week after, the year after. So you would not see what you could call a reconstruction strategy or an exit strategy in proper manner. So we spoke about many incidents that happened afterwards. For example, who is responsible for the equipment that is left over by coalition forces? And I have to say, as humans, we all agree that it is forces, but it is very difficult to execute this responsibility in reality. So we spoke about consequences of not having a plan. And that means we had 4 rounds, we had the 4 questions, we have the players that all looked at different perspectives and largely at the same problems. And then we went towards a debriefing. And in the debriefing, as I mentioned, if you are addressing this to a particular audience, you would focus on the elements that they would deem the most relevant. But I always included at least 2 things, and that was the impressions of each group. So if military is playing the civilian side, all right, what was your impression, or what was something that you have previously not known that you now noticed? And that would again show a bit realistic dynamic of warfare. And the second part was comparison to other urban battles. And this part is very much opened. So I would say that you should just cover the battles you are most familiar with and that bring the most interesting points. For myself, I used the Warsaw Uprising. I come from Poland, so I know a lot about dilemmas that happened there and what are the lessons we need to draw from it. And also on historical side, I used the liberation of Breda by Polish General Maciek. And then I could also, especially if I was conducting this war game in Netherlands, I could connect the history to reality, and people would explicitly know why it is important to know the information that was given to them during the war game. And it was not the purpose of the war game to get them to know the Battle of Mosul, but it was the purpose to extract the important knowledge about urban combat. And I see that largely as a good result. So we saw that it was perceived as a good starter. It was a good demonstration, so you could draw it into more universal level. It was not so laser focused on one topic or one area. it was translatable to bigger audiences and people that completely do not know wargaming, but were still interested to see how it plays out. And that led to the experience that everybody deserves a meaningful wargame, because it is basically a tool for us. It is not the point to do it just for doing. And that was the second case study. I see many questions, so I will get right to it. If you have a new one, just also go ahead. The first one, how do you model time pressure in the quick decision game? Depends what is the focus, because actually I would not say that you have to have a time pressure. So if you want to check if somebody is capable of decision making under time pressure, then you can introduce any number of clocks. So the bigger the clock, the more annoying it is. And then you can say within 5 minutes, you have to give me an answer what you are doing and why. And some people would indeed perceive it as a difficulty, others not. So it depends if you want to go deeper into that direction. I have another question. Why it was decided to give the after action report right after the decision was made? Would a real life situation take a little bit more time before the consequences are known? So the more time would have to pass to understand what the decision means. Correct. In this case, we were also traveling under a bit succumbed time frame. So we have been discussing in these questions things that happened over 2 years. But because most of the war games had only 2 to 3 hours to be executed, and I wanted to highlight a number of elements, that is the reason that you directly hear not the answer, but the reality that followed instead. And you are able to compare yourself to people on the ground, how they solved it and how your answer would respond. And at the lowest level, I at least want my participants to not do worse, but I have no control over it. I have also a question from Kaya. After several years of experience and data from many exercises, do I think that artificial intelligence as a red team makes sense? What are the reasons and the gaps, disadvantages? I would say, again, it depends on purpose. What I notice is, of course, you need an intelligent enemy. So if you are preparing to revise your strategy or see what is the weakness, the strength, if you are looking at alternative models of defending the alliance, then you would have to think about, all right, what can the artificial intelligence simulate in that situation? I think it is quite good to amass problems. So you would be able to show that it shuts down a number of systems you are dependent on, and that is useful. But for example, there are a lot of low-tech successful solutions that were tested against NATO or other countries that you would not be able to simulate with artificial intelligence. So if you think about the so-called humanitarian convoys, which actually transported ammunition and equipment, this of course is based on humans' idea to outsmart the enemy. And that part, I would say, is very tricky to simulate. So it is very good to look at the systemic and logistical problems, but it would be quite difficult to turn it into intelligent enemy that attacks you where it is unexpected. And I also have a question about the fourth question in the war game, which was, what do you want to do after the city is liberated? I saw that all players were both relieved and really eager to answer this, because that is usually where the planning or the war games stop. So they were very happy with that question, because it challenges the notion of ended intervention and then not continuing to reconstruct or stabilize the given area. All right, Brian, thank you for your comments. I see as well question about other war games, so I will pick it up at the end. And we also see a question about participants. Have they, I think this is what the question is about, have they improved over time? So I will also pick it up after the last case study. Because that also leads me to the next example, and that will be the biggest in terms of number of participants. As I told you, the previous experience has shown me that everybody deserves a meaningful war game, and that meant also that I started to look for a way to bring a war game into a bigger exercise. So it would support an element of an international exercise, and that way it could complement what is being done on NATO level. And that is the part that I will come back to about collective training and individual performance. After seeing many war games, I have started to wonder what makes people win, and can you measure competence based on war game performance? So if you would look at the war game and think that it also shows you different assessments about people playing it, then you would be able to extract valuable information about possible best assignments or best tasks for a given individual. And at the same time that I was thinking about this, about competence in war games and the question of why do some people win more than others, I received a request for support in an international exercise, Joint Cooperation 2019, that is yearly organized by Nimborg, but I am not sure how that can work now. In any case, they asked me whether I could prepare something that would achieve two things. And that was, let's say, part of activities that preceded the maneuvers and the kinetic tasks, all of the different exercise efforts. And they wanted to have something that would facilitate familiarization with scenario. So if you have ever participated in a NATO or international exercise, you know that you get a fat book with different data, with country descriptions, with maybe some events or characteristics. And most of the time, if it is an international exercise, it would also be fictional, which makes it very difficult to motivate yourself to get familiar with this amount of fictional data and retain it for the time of the exercise. So they wanted something that would make it more experiential, immersive, so it would be easier to play it out. And since these are usually large crowds, they also wanted to have something that would introduce the participants to each other. So there would be some previous contact before they go into shooting ranges and other locations. And these were the two basic requirements. And I also wanted to look at the competence measurements. So I wanted to see whether there are some interesting observations I can collect on that. So the main problem that the war game addressed was information overload and also low motivation or retention of fictional data that you only use for 2 weeks, and then what would be the point, right? So the only manner to approach it was to make it into a kind of a war game that people can play with, and they, in a manner, don't even notice that they are remembering the dynamics because they just played it out. The approach that I have chosen was a combination of the purpose, but also the circumstances. At the time that the request came in, we already knew that there would be between 80 and 100 participants. So I would normally classify this as a mega game. But at the same time, we also knew that it will be quite a setting that we would have to adjust to. So it was a huge military tent, and let's say the microphone was half time working. So it was something that we knew could not be too much high tech and had to really work in all possible settings. So this was largely a team exercise, and it was run by pen, paper, and a lot of shouting, which with my voice could be quite unpleasant. But everybody followed me, and I would also say that it turned out fine. What I started with is, of course, I went through the scenario and I extracted 12 players. So again, you had not only the NATO or the EU in this case, because they were involved as well, European Union, but you also had the red team, which was troublemakers, and you also had local people, you had representatives of political parties, you had the Farmers Association, you had the bikers gang. So a lot of different non-state groups that you now see trending towards actors. And with that, 12 groups, and all of them had parts of information about the country book and the scenario. So they would know something the others don't. And we had 12 groups, and I asked for 12 leaders. And it was very much, you could call it, in a frame of a show, because we had a big stage. So I asked each person to come and join me on the stage, and they would receive the assignment, the players' information. So that played out like a mega game. And after we established 12 groups, 12 leaders, they formed a team. And because one of the purposes was to introduce them to strangers that they were not aware of, they received random assignments with people that they don't know. So we had that part going. Once they formed a team, and the team was around 8 people, they would make a strategy, because in all of the descriptions there was a goal that they were supposed to achieve. And we knew that since part of it was living the experience and the scenario, then we wanted them to interact in a form of a meeting. So all the groups met with each other, and then they also exchanged the information they had on the sheets, and they tried to convince each other to reach their objectives. And it ended, we needed around 2.5 hours to conduct all of the meetings. It ended with a pitch, elevator pitch, so each group could still say for 1 minute, and I was here very precise. So if you need time pressure, tell the group that they have 1 minute to present their plan, their strategy. And within that 1 minute, they had last chance to convince everybody to vote for them. Because the mechanics were twofold, and that was connected with the purpose. The first one was that leaders of the team had 3 voting cards. They could give -3 points if some of the teams really performed bad. They had +1 point, so that would be small support of somebody's agenda, and +3 points, which is kind of a vote of confidence if you translate it in terms of the outcome. And you can notice, okay, the leader has only 3 voting cards, but there's 12 teams. So they really had to choose their associations within that part. And that led to appointment of different points. There was a group that received -5. I think they tried to be very aggressive despite a scenario of peaceful / hybrid activities. So they simply chose a strategy that did not fit into the environment they were playing. And that was a clear failure. Next to the kind of peer voting that was organized, I had a second scoring, and that was more connected with my goal of looking at competence. I had 3 evaluators from different backgrounds, military, business, air defense, academic, different backgrounds, different nationalities. So I would say their preconceptions about performance could be very different. And that also eliminated possible bias if they would be too close into the same direction. And they had individual cards 5 times 1 point. So they would not be looking at a group performance. They would be picking the strongest players in the wargame. So I would know a bit about what makes certain people more successful. There, is it incidental or is it more universal? And it turned out that these 3 evaluators from very different backgrounds, they all pointed to the same persons. And I also have to say they had 2.5 hours, but they made their decision within the first 15 minutes. And they observed the whole wargame, so they could change their mind, but their convictions were upheld towards the end. So that made me think about the individual in the wargame and the competence that is in the end immediately noticed and universally recognized. So it could be that wargames are very good for measuring people's abilities in a certain context. So you would say these persons are stronger in this scenario or in this tasking. Or you could pick up the natural talents, which I think is a very important information, especially in a coalition. When it comes to the results of the wargame itself, of course, a big part of it was introduction and making everybody acquainted with the information as well as each other. So I can say it ended with a hooray because it was a simulated contest and you could indeed get the information without thinking about it or memorizing it. You could rather live it, which became just fun. And I can also share with you that the winning team was the Farmers Association. So it was more of a joker or an additional player that just simulated people living in the area, but it ended up to be the most trustworthy player. So if you are in a situation of peace or just activities below the threshold, then you will notice that credibility is stronger with neutral players. because if people want to preserve peace, they will not side with the extreme blocs. They will go for the moderate and the center. And then you also notice that political parties were automatically distrusted. And that's why farmers, they are the closest to daily life and they received the most support. And I can also say that within that team, we had a lot of individuals that were awarded by evaluators. So these two things coming together decided for the winners, and also showed me again that this experience of competence being immediately noticed and universally recognized is holding up. So that was, let's say, the third and the biggest war game that I have conducted at that time. And they three separately gave very different results, very different conclusions. So I will look at your questions, and then I will say a couple of words about conclusions of the three separate case studies, how I connected in my mind. But feel free to drop your comments and questions in the meantime. I see that couple of agreements that we have on the state of the world, so I will leave it. I see a question, well, more a comment than a question from Torsten Kodal, and I know very well that he's a designer and executor of excellent war games. And he tells me that he has the same problem of evaluation of students, and he is using more seminar style matrix war games, which are more open. The mechanics are very permitting of introducing out of the box thinking and new actions. And again, the only limitation is indeed probability that is assigned to it. And it is important to allow the students to separate themselves from the role and reflect on the application of their own ideas. So on one way you have the experience of the war game, but you also have to separate yourself from it and translate it to how you can use it. And I like to come back to what General Mattis said once. He said it about reading, but I think it applies equally well. He said that reading is like taking care of your intellectual garden. So you start planting seeds that and you watch them grow. And the reason for that is not because you're the gardener, but because you face the dilemmas that might come in the future head on earlier. So you are able to at least think about it. I think you will not solve it, but you can think about it, what would be the issues and how to approach them. And maybe what would be your personal stance to it. And I have a question. How long did it take to design each of these games? Difficult question because it varies. I would say the first war game was the longest on one side to convince the official structures to allow to play it. So I had to proceed it with a lot of briefings about usability, about value, about how it looks like and what comes out of wargaming. So that took a year to amass enough knowledge and conduct to be allowed the decision. And the design of the game can span anything from a month to 3 years. So I would say that your prototype can be quickly, but then the improvements to it and functional proficiency can take much longer. So the Baltic Challenge, it was done on a short notice because as I told you, it was simply an opportunity to play it out in an upcoming course that I did not want to miss. So I prepared the first prototype, and I would not recommend it to anybody, but I prepared it in a week. But that was, let's say, a roughly draft, how it looks like, how it works like, and what will be built on it. But it was enough to try it. And after that, I improved the graphics, the explanation, the briefing, so everything was growing with the time that it was given. When it comes to Mosul case study wargame, it took longer because I wanted to interview more people about it and to reach out to humanitarians and locals about the experience of the events. And that meant a longer research. So I would say that it took at least 3 to 6 months to establish the truth in it that I can show. And I can also mention, okay, my experience in researching warfare is spanning for 15 years. So I was also aware of different case studies I could compare it to. So that part I had, but maybe the facilitator that picks it up has to prepare it on their own terms, and that could also cost time to find their debriefing strategy. Or the other way around, maybe they are quicker than me to prepare it. So that depends where this quick decision game is going. And the last one, the joint cooperation mega game, I think we started to talk about it 6 months before it came to exist. And the concept clarified within a month. And the preparations lasted also a month to test it, to deconflict it, because we had 12 groups running the meeting simultaneously, so it had to be worked out. So I would not say that it took full time 6 months, but it was developing over that period. And I will again reiterate that it depends what are your parameters. Within this project, we did not have a budget that could cover more fancy equipment, because that could maybe make it longer but different. So that was the choice of many mechanics that were simple to use within a month or two. And I also can say that I was working largely by myself, or with 2 or 3 colleagues that were assisting me out of their goodwill rather than official appointment. So if there are bigger departments, they are probably able to roll it out quicker. But this was the times that I had to account for. There is a question from Neil. Can I tell something about traditional kinetic wargaming in the NATO context? Is it done by industry or think tanks for NATO leaders, or entirely by military personnel? Is it something that was done in the Cold War but is no longer done, or is it coming back? Thank you for that very long question. I will divide it, split it up. I can say something about kinetic wargaming. I would say that largely it is now digital, and you have different levels of wargaming that you can look at. So it is tactical, operational, strategic. On political level, it is obviously more sensitive, so it is then relegated to NATO headquarters, and there is at least one exercise a year where on the political level they are looking at response strategies and different actions that would make sense. Whereas below, so headquarters and units, they usually train, as I said, digitally, and there's a couple of different software that is used, and that is mostly outsourced in terms of programming. but the operators are military. So you would have the program that is done outside of NATO, but it would be run locally by a given operator. And it is definitely done extensively. And that is also maybe the reason that war games that I have described did not have such a strong element of it, because it would, it is not necessary, it is already done. So it is not a requirement that I would receive. All right, I also have a question about Matrix games. I think that I can say that similar open action systems are used, but I have never seen a Matrix game played out in its classical form that I know very well. For example, from Tom Mowat. We spoke about the Black Sea Matrix wargame, and I had some ideas about it. But indeed, I did not experience it at my time. All right, Neil, I see your comment. I spoke about kinetic warfare, and Neil is asking specifically about tabletop wargaming. So I can say that tabletops are tricky. Indeed, I see them in different headquarters being done to test their plans, their contingency planning, or their area responsibility. And that is then largely prepared by the training division within that headquarters. I was able to also participate or design a couple of tabletop war games that were dealing with that. So it is necessary, definitely, and it can also be connected with other topics. So, for example, I used one to highlight the cultural property protection. So we would simply have it on the map and think about it, how that influences, for example, targeting lists. So I can say that definitely it is a living practice, and that it is mostly, as far as I know, conducted by the headquarters themselves. I do not know of such think tanks, or you also mentioned industry that would provide the tabletops. They do provide, obviously, software for analytical purposes, but not, as far as I know, the tabletops. And maybe there are exceptions on national level. There's a lot of companies that works with individual nation that I am aware of, but not yet on NATO level, or it was not brought to my attention. Do I recommend some games? Diederik is asking, and do I have some that impressed me the most, and why? Again, very big question, because I would say that one of the parts of being wargame designer is actually playing games. And that is because you are exposed to different mechanics, different ideas, different topics. And sometimes you pick up very good things. Sometimes you also have the obligation to look at something and say, yeah, that is not correct. And the longer you are playing war games, the more you are able to see. That's why I always playtest with hobby gamers, because I just see that their catalog of possible solutions is endless, because their memory, and that is very much muscle memory of playing war games, comes back sometimes decades. So they can tell more about why this particular model is not the best or the other way around. So I don't know if I have a top 10 of games. I think that I enjoy experimentation. When it comes to war games, I very much like realistic settings, and I like when it conveys some part of the real events, because I have also learned that this creates value on its own, and it can bring a message forward about sometimes victories, sometimes failures, sometimes the role of luck in differentiating between the two. So that would be my short answer, because the long one would have to take maybe another seminar. So I have 3 conclusions that I will say before I go into overall questions that you might have that are not so connected with each case study. The first one, and that one started with the Baltics, but it also progressed with other war games, is to always pit your war game against reality. And whether you check it with a field visit, so you would see the area, see the terrain, feel the atmosphere, see how that is existing. As an example, within the city that we wargamed in the Baltics, it is an old city, so it has 4 different religions. And always the participants would try to attack them for the reason of creating social ripple effect and some tensions between given groups. But when I visited that city the same year, I also went to see the churches and the temples, how they looked like. And believe me, I was the only one. So simply over the time, people living in that city disengaged from religious life. And that was not a place of meeting or a place that had any influence on the society. So if you would do these actions, they would be completely outrageous, but they would also be ineffective. So it is very important to cross-check with reality, and that can be done by either personally looking at the place, or if it's not possible, you can also do interviews with people that have lived through it or interacted with it. And you can also look at a number of materials that speak about the given scenario. And I have worked a lot on it, and I think it is important to introduce different perspectives. And obviously, most of the war games do not feature civilians, but I have tried to introduce them to show the dynamics of warfare. For example, in the city, what would be the consequence of having 250,000 civilians within the city center when the campaign is at its decisive point. And that brings me to my second conclusion: to broaden your perspective, your audience, and always go for the highest relevance. So if you are deciding on your scenario, think what would bring the most important and actual information to the participants, but also do not limit it to your own reading of that, but check it. So broaden the perspective that is both in the war game, but also outside of it. And that usually means you should open the war game beyond your traditional scope, which might be quite tricky, but I've done that by, for example, testing the war game with university students or with complete civilians that have nothing to do with wargaming. And then you will not, of course, get practical results out of it, but you can ask yourself whether your explanation is clear enough to reach anybody. And that way you could get a war game that is more applicable in reality, it has higher impact because more people are interested in what is in it. And that brings me to the last conclusion, the third one. How can you use war games? And you have to always critically review whether you have met the purpose or maybe the purpose changed during your development. And if you see that your wargame is improving the practice, then you have to prepare a set of arguments that enables you to defend it. So what is the actual value? And you know that within organizations, time is precious and commitment even more. So what would make people commit to taking the time to participate in it? And how does that improve, if not their performance, then the practice and the workings of the organization, if you speak about this particular story. So in the end, these were the 3 case studies, and I would be happy to answer your questions if you have any. If not, then I scroll because I think I missed some beforehand. I see that we have a question or more a comment about the 3P model, the product, the process, and the people. So you would look at what the war game, the product, is supposed to be, what processes does the people in it apply, and what was the role of persons that play it, including your own. So I agree, let's say, with this presentation of the process. I would say that I added to it because I ended up with 7 elements that I used to design war games. And the reason is not because it improves how you make the war game, but because it improves how you can communicate it afterwards. And at least within this project, it lasted 4 years, and that was also the design of the wargaming project, that we knew it will cease to exist because it was kind of experimental making. And that meant that very early into the process, I started introducing things that would allow handover to other designers or other staff members. And to transfer this responsibility, you also have to explain things that happened between process people and the product. And for example, why did you choose a particular approach to do it this way? Or what is the meaning of results that you want to achieve? Also, what are the materials, the methods? So you look not only at the outcome of the war game itself, but you also look through how you came there as a designer. So I found it useful to transcribe it. The first reason, as I mentioned, because you can easily pass it on and that it becomes a collective game of the organization, and it can be executed not as a link to the facilitator or designer, but as the capability of the organization. But also, second part, so if you have this transcribed, you can add to it. And too many war games, I have found out that there are additional things I like, but they do not align with the original purpose. So I would have them as a backup if I see that I have a particular group that is focused on, let's say, social network analysis. Then I would have a module that I can introduce so they would play it out if we had the right time and place for it. And I had lists for most of the war games where I could come in and out from the base game, and also, I guess on the commercial market, you could call them expansions, but they were more additional components that could be introduced. So if you have this transcription, you are able to trace it back, how it came to be this, and what are the alternatives in terms of if you need, as I said, these additional elements. And the third part is maybe my personal experience, that obviously I had lots of notes from my designs, and at the time that I closed the project, I wanted to summarize it, and I noticed that when I was looking through the notes, a lot of things I solved and I forgot. So there were valuable hints within my notes, but until they are transcribed for everybody to process, yeah, they are lost. They are simply lost. So that was a big reason why I also decided to share it with the book format, because I knew that I could come back to it as well as show it forward. And I see a question about young designers. What advice would I give to beginning designers? I would say create. Start creating. And the reason is, there was also a bigger discussion about it recently, that wargaming is not an established career. That means it will be extremely difficult to get appointed as a wargamer, or to find an organization which would recognize you in your expertise. And that means most probably you have to start with creating war games that show your ability and that can establish you as a war gamer. And the reason is that with that given accomplishment, you are able to communicate much better what is your specialty, or how do you design your war games, what are your successes in that domain, because it is very difficult. Let's say in wargaming, it is very heavy on the practice side. It is quite slim on the theory and institutional side. So there are a couple of places like Georgetown University with Professor Sebastian Bay and with the association that you have that promote wargaming, but it is still on the level of associations and kind of guild of professionals, and it is very difficult maybe to break into such model of market. And that is also, let's say, the reason that large part of my book was dedicated to dilemmas, different dilemmas of design, because I thought maybe they are quite obvious things, but nobody ever explains them. So there is a large body of knowledge that is common, but it is never presented. And then I simply described the conversation I had about designing games, about realistic versus artificial scenarios, about measurement versus meaning, and all of these things, because I thought it is like standing at a crossroads and you don't know whether you want to go east or west or north or south. And people are going there, so you are not alone, but you don't know what was the reasoning behind choosing that road. So I basically experimented with taking all of them. So it was quite exhausting, but in the end it produced a number of answers. So if you want to reach Warsaw, go east. If you want to go to Barcelona, go south. So it in a manner explains how you could approach this constant questions and very visible dilemmas And I hope that this conversation also evolves based on this basic notions that I started to list within the book. And for young designers, that would be my main advice, that very often you will need to start creating, present for yourself and for others what is the value that you are able to create before even starting any professional engagement. So what I see in wargaming is that we have a lot of wargamers that are double-headed. So either they are military or university staff, or also industry, but rarely do you have somebody that would go as a wargame designer, period. So that means you will have to work on incorporating wargaming into your professional life, and that can be tricky, definitely. But on a positive note, I can also say that the community for me was very generous. I see very open, very friendly persons inside, and definitely young designers are welcomed, and we want to see more good ideas. We want to see more people that do wargaming. So that is maybe a paradox, that it is difficult to get in, but it is very open. So that would be on the bright side. You can always reach out to me or other established designers, and I have done that before, and I had brilliant conversations and very good connections on this front. And I can say that every year I participate in Connections Netherlands, the conference organized by Hans Stensma and his team. And that is also very good to participate in events that are deliberately and exclusively about wargaming, because then you can also start to stir up how to use war games in a professional manner, and do that together with the community that, as I said, for me was very generous, and I still I'm very happy to be part of it, very proud. All right, I don't know if there is last question. I see there are a couple of comments also about conflict simulations, and I will leave you at suspense because there is a question coming. All right, we have last question. Did I have to overcome any gender bias in the wargaming arena? I can say that in my perspective, I have wargamed mostly in Europe, and by Europe I mean Netherlands, Germany, Poland, Slovenia. And in these countries, I was treated as a professional, so actually gender did not play a role. I think that I was assessed based on the merit of my war games. And I also attribute within the bigger discipline, as I said, we have brilliant professionals and designers that are supportive of diversity, and I have never encountered discrimination on that front. I have seen it outside of Europe, which might be a not so positive story. And then I recognized indeed how it looks like, and started to develop counter tactics. So I would say if you are in the same position, I would indeed keep to the community that is very welcoming, very open, and completely supportive. Whereas if you encounter such cases, then yeah, there is a way to fight it, of course. and to choose your commitments as well. And I see one more question. What organizations within NATO are doing wargaming professionally? Interesting question, because I have to say that NATO, as far as I know, do not have their own wargame designers. And then you have the Modeling and Simulation Center of Excellence, but I would say the role is more collecting the existing solutions and research studies. So is there an organization that is dedicated to wargaming? I would not pinpoint anyone that I could attribute it to. I would say it is present in many headquarters or units or centers. As I mentioned, CCOE as well had that project opened for the last 4 years. So it seems like there are a lot of initiatives, but I would not say there is an organization within that binds them and leads them. All right.
All right, I think that's our last question, Natalia. Thank you again for taking the time and sharing your experience with us. It was fantastic. For those who are gonna unavoidably ask if this is gonna be available later, yes, it will be available later on YouTube. I put the link in our chat to our website, but also our YouTube channel where it will be posted later. Please thank Natalia in the chat for her wonderful presentation with us and engaging with us on such a personal level too. And thank you everyone for engaging with Goose and our speaker today. Hope you attend our next lecture coming up this Thursday with Matt Caffrey. If you have any questions, you can contact Goose directly through our website or to myself via email. And thank you again, everyone.